Hi, JS.la. My name is Forrest Akin, and I want to show you some code and tell you a few things that I like about it. So this is a function called sum duration strings. In the comment, I've provided an example of what you expect when you use it. Given a space delimited string of minute second duration strings, sum duration strings is going to give you a duration string back that represents the sum of its input. You might be wondering to yourself, this is a function, where are the arguments? Instead of declaring arguments and handling them directly, I'm using the pipe function here to compose these three other functions in order to satisfy my requirements. The way that pipe works is it takes any number of functions you want to give it as arguments, and it returns a new function. When that new function is called, it passes the arguments it received to the first function that was given to pipe. Then the result of that function is passed as the input to the next function. So what you're finally going to get back is the result from the last function. Since it's kind of difficult to tell what this function will do in vanilla JavaScript without seeing what arguments it takes and what it does with them, I'm using a generic TypeScript interface that I made called unary. Unary is just any function that takes in one argument and returns something. So unary here is parameterized by an input and output type. And I'm using that to communicate this is a function, takes a string argument, and it returns a duration string. This function is an application of the duration domain, sitting between the domain and the outside world. The domain doesn't speak to the outside world. It sits in a safe little place all by itself. Let's take a peek into the duration domain. This is the duration domain. It's a collection of functions to facilitate interaction with data representing the concept of a duration. And still, no function bodies or arguments anywhere. I tend to avoid creating function bodies because without them, I'm way less likely to just keep adding line after line to a function as new requirements surface. Everything becomes way less hackable. Instead, I try to consider what composition of functions would accomplish the task at hand. And that's exactly what we find here. Every function is defined completely in terms of other simpler functions without adding any ad hoc handling of data. This is compositional. I really love this because it enables me to concisely communicate at a high level what will be done without getting bogged down by the details of how it'll be done. That's called being declarative. So even the types are actually declarative. Instead of saying, for example, that this function will take a string or a number and return a string, I've made type aliases down here to communicate what those types actually represent in this domain. This isn't just any number. This isn't just any string. The number actually represents an amount of seconds, and the string represents a duration string with specific formatting requirements. Now, I know this isn't anything like the style of JavaScript a lot of people are kind of used to. Even my formatting conventions are pretty unusual for JavaScript. I've actually developed my own system of formatting that recursively places each expression inside a nice little box, such that each part of the expression is as close to the rest of the expression as possible. Notice I'm also leading with the comma, so the first character in each line immediately communicates if this line is going to be a continuation of the previous. There's even a lot more space than usual. And I do that so that every token can be easily taken in with less risk of getting lost in the code. I really try to leverage every tool I possibly can to expressively communicate my intent. I didn't always code like this. When I started, I might have written something like this. This function actually accomplishes the exact same task as the original, but instead it's just one big function for the entire implementation. One problem, one function. And more recently, I might have done something like this. It's divided the problem into a bunch of simpler subproblems. It's similarly factored as the original example, but it lacks the same kind of structure and compositionality of it. But I'm not just showing you this to demonstrate my progression from writing bad code to good code, because code isn't simply good or bad. As software engineers, we constantly juggle a myriad of concerns when writing code, and I believe it's our values that inform which ones we choose to prioritize. And that's exactly what this represents to me. It's an accumulation of values over the years, many of which were the result of some of the worst experiences in my career. So tonight, I'd like to share one of those experiences with you. I would have called this a coding horror, but that name was already taken. So instead, I'm going to be presenting to you my code crucible. I hope it'll offer some insight into how you can use some challenging circumstances in your career as fuel for discovering and refining your own values. So the project, date-based pricing. I'm still pretty new to the company, but I guess I had made a good impression because they decided to throw me headfirst into the deep end. This is going to be a solo system spanning full stack project where I would be creating a new service responsible for all of the pricing logic. And I would also implement date-based pricing, a new feature that'll give users the ability to assign start and or end dates for prices on products and price sheets. Little did I know, there were many problems. Problems I was mostly clueless about, but slowly and painfully discovered as the project progressed. Naturally, the requirements were extremely vague, offering little to nothing in terms of acceptance criteria. Pricing logic I was meant to consolidate into this new service was scattered across the entire system. Ad hoc pricing logic was all over the place on the front end and back end, which kind of made sense because this was a 5+ year old Node.js system in which quality maintenance had rarely been prioritized. And when you combine all of that with the fact that I was still really new to the company and had little domain knowledge or familiarity with the code base, this was the perfect storm. I was definitely set up to fail on this project. So here's a peek into some of the challenges I experienced. Testing. I didn't always write tests, and that definitely bit me at the beginning of this project. Made it a lot slower due to all the mental processing I was constantly doing, and it resulted in a lot of regressions in the early stages. But luckily, I finally caved and started writing tests. I don't think I could have finished this project without them. Yes, the tech debt. This term gets thrown around really loosely, but it absolutely applies in this case. This was the definition of legacy code: poorly tested, poorly documented code that I did not write. Many functions had grown beyond 500 lines. Some functions were beyond 1,000 lines, with side effects around every corner. And to top it off, there was a nice helping of in-house framework magic, front end and back end in-house frameworks. I really think it would have been a miracle if any human being was able to reason about this system. Finally, this was a long solo project, as you probably could guess. It took at least twice as long as planned to complete, probably closer to 3 times, because I was constantly discovering new landmines. I ended up pulling several all-nighters because I just wanted it to all be over. And that, of course, didn't help my mental well-being. It was an extremely lonely experience for me. I was working near people, but not with them. I desperately wanted some form of collaboration. I grew resentful for having such an awful project dumped on me. It seemed like a hopeless situation. So I went searching for answers. How does code even become like this? Who do I blame? Well, turns out no one wrote this code in malice. Anger, perhaps, but not malice. I started learning about the role values played in software from people like Brian Cantrell and Steve Klabnik. It all kind of started to add up. What I was experiencing was Conway's Law, the idea that a software system structure mirrors the organization that built it. There were deep-rooted issues in my organization that contributed to development being carried out in a haphazard frenzy for many, many years. Developers that wrote the code weren't bad developers. They were simply responding to the pressures placed on them by the organization and leadership. It really was no wonder that after over 5 years, this is what the system had become. Understanding this helped me be less resentful because I was able to empathize with the developers instead of blame them. There was no way I was going to change this organization. They've been operating this way since forever. So what could I do to prevent code from becoming like this? What was in my control? I've been dabbling with some functional ideas for a couple of years, but this really sent me down the rabbit hole. Because functional programming is all about applying techniques and constraints in order to maintain reasonability in software as it evolves, something I was desperately missing. So I spent tons of my free time at lunch, after work, just finding resources to learn more, and took every opportunity I could to apply what I was learning to this project. I read Brian Lonsdorf's Mostly Adequate Guide to Functional Programming and Eric Elliott's Composing Software, found new podcasts like Magic Read Along and Co-Recursive. I didn't even understand half of the stuff that they talked about in Magic Read Along. It just brought me a ton of joy to listen to Brian Lonsdorf and Hardy Jones joke around and nerd about functional programming. I also found new heroes. Brian Lonsdorf for functional programming and JavaScript, Runar Bjarnson for showing me how the constraints of functional programming are liberating, and Bartosz Maluski for showing me how category theory is a seriously powerful abstraction for composing software. Focusing my energy on learning truly helped me keep my sanity. But I was still all alone in this project. So I went looking for community in whatever way I could. I created a recurring Tech Talks meeting at work to provide a platform for people to share whatever was interesting to them. I got more involved with js.la, signing up as a mentor for the mentorship program, and also as a mentee. I also signed up as a presenter. I joined the functional programming Slack team. I started attending the Santa Monica Haskell meetup. And I was lucky enough to have a couple of friends that were willing to nerd out with me on some functional topics too. Eventually, I realized I would be much happier at a company that shared some of these same values that I was beginning to discover in myself. So I searched for companies that explicitly listed values for quality and functional programming in their job descriptions. I only found 2. And before I knew it, I was signing an offer with my current employer, CJ Affiliate. In a lot of ways, it's the company I've been trying to find since I moved to LA in 2016. Get to work with people that are committed to their craft, and I have a ton to learn from them. I don't think I even would have ended up at CJ if this experience hadn't forced me to dig deeper into what I valued. I don't think I've arrived yet. I still have a long road ahead of me in this career, but I've found more of who I am and who I want to be. So that's the end of my story. In closing, I just want to say the obvious. Work isn't always what we hope. Sometimes it's the worst, and it tries us in ways we never expected. But we can use these experiences as fuel for our own self-discovery and growth. But don't go it alone. Find a community that shares your values and will support you in digging into your passions. I got a list of resources here that I mentioned during the talk. And if you want to see any of the code I showed or used to make this presentation, I made it with React Spectacle. You can find all of that on my GitHub here. And that's it.